There are things in Bloodborne that the game never explains. Things buried so deep in item descriptions and enemy placements and half-finished NPC dialogue that even years of dedicated research haven't produced a single agreed-upon answer. And that's exactly what this video is about. I put this together because I've spent a long time going through the lore of Bloodborne, and there's one side of it that doesn't get enough focused attention: the mysteries that remain genuinely unsolved. Not we have a popular theory unsolved. Actually unsolved. The kind where every angle you look at it from opens up a new question instead of closing one. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to exclude the mysteries where the community has basically landed on a consensus, even if that consensus is imperfect. What you're going to hear about are the ones where the ground is still moving. I also chose to move through these not by region or faction, but by how deeply they cut into the foundations of the world. Some of what's here is strange but manageable. Some of it points toward things that, if true, would change the way you read everything else in the game. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The First Hunters and What They Left Behind. The game hands you the hunter's dream on a silver platter and then immediately starts lying to you about what it is. That's not an accident. The dream is framed as a refuge, a safe place where you can level up and buy bullets and talk to a doll that isn't quite alive. But the longer you spend in Bloodborne, the clearer it becomes that the hunter's dream is itself one of the game's most unresolved and unsettling spaces. And the mystery starts with the people who were there before you. Yharnam is the first hunter. That much is established. But what the game does not clearly explain is what being the first hunter actually cost him. And more importantly, whether the things he left behind in that dream were put there deliberately or whether they were left as warnings. His workshop sits in the dream like a museum nobody visits. The tools hanging on the walls, the discarded weapons, the notes that don't add up to a complete picture. It suggests a man who spent a very long time preparing something, though what he was preparing for is not obvious. The plain doll is one of the most discussed figures in Bloodborne lore, and yet the question of her origin remains genuinely open. She is fashioned after someone. The game points toward Maria, the hunter from the DLC, as a likely model. But fashioned by whom and under what circumstances is a question that the item descriptions don't fully resolve. Yharnam's attachment to the doll is clear from the way his dialogue shifts when she's nearby. What's less clear is whether that attachment is the cause of something or the result of something. One reading of the workshop suggests that Yharnam was not the only person involved in its construction. The number of tools present, the variety of them, the way certain workbenches show signs of multiple users, all of this points toward a founding cohort rather than a single craftsman. If that's true, then the question becomes, what happened to the others? The dream doesn't retain obvious traces of them, which is itself unusual. Things tend to persist in the dream. The workshop persists. The doll persists. The graves outside persist. The absence of those other people is a presence of its own. The graves outside Yharnam's workshop are one of the most quietly disturbing details in the entire game. They are marked with hunter tools, with weapons that have been driven into the ground over the stones. The implication is that these are the graves of hunters who died in the dream itself, or perhaps hunters whose bodies never returned from the waking world. But graves in a dream are philosophically strange. You don't bury a dream. The fact that someone went to the effort of marking those stones with real weapons suggests that whoever made them understood the difference between a burial and a memorial, and chose to make a memorial anyway. The workshop contains a chime that doesn't appear to have a clear function in the standard progression of the game. Certain items reference it only obliquely. The fact that it exists at all, that someone included it in the design of this space, points toward a function that may have been cut or that operates entirely outside the player's direct experience. Whether that function relates to the hunters buried outside or to something that Yharnam was trying to accomplish before the events of the game is not resolved anywhere in the text. Yharnam's dialogue, when you approach him late in the game, is calibrated to sound like relief. He wants to be free. He tells you this clearly, but the nature of his imprisonment is described in terms that don't quite match any single lore entry. The moon presence holds him. That part is clear. What's less clear is what Yharnam offered or did to place himself in that position in the first place. The relationship between a hunter and a Great One is not a standard transaction. Something passed between them that the game declines to name. The old hunter garb, specifically the flavor text attached to various pieces of it, references hunters who came before the main game's timeline and who operated under different conditions. The distinction between those early hunters and the hunters of the present is mostly framed in terms of technique and equipment, but there are small phrases embedded in those descriptions that suggest the early hunters knew something that later hunters did not. Something specific about the nature of the hunt that got lost or was deliberately removed from the institutional knowledge passed down through the workshop. The pellet, one of the most basic consumables in the game, has a description that references the first hunters directly and attributes to them a particular relationship with blood that predates the formal study of blood echoes. This is easy to overlook because the pellet is such a mundane item, but it suggests that the first hunters had access to a body of practical knowledge that wasn't derived from Bergenworth or from any of the scholars. It was older than that. Where it came from and who taught it is not explained. There is a theory that the hunter's dream was not Yharnam's idea, but the architecture of it, the rules that govern it, the specific way that it persists outside normal time, reflect a design imposed from outside. The moon presence would be the obvious candidate, but the dream's layout contains elements that don't obviously serve the moon presence's interests. The weapons, the research materials, the ability to level up using echoes. These are things that make hunters more capable. Why would a captor want their prisoner to train replacements effectively? The answer may be that the moon presence didn't design the dream at all, or that it designed only part of it, and that Yharnam filled in the rest with his own intentions. The lantern in the hunter's dream burns constantly and has no apparent fuel source. This is a small detail that most players absorb without comment, but the specific visual design of that lantern differs from every other lantern in the game. It burns differently. The light it produces has a quality that the game's other light sources don't replicate. If that's a deliberate artistic choice rather than an asset shortcut, it implies that the dream's lantern is drawing on something other than oil or wick. What it's drawing on, and whether that source is finite, are not addressed. The graves outside the workshop increase in number across different playthroughs of the game, or at least the implication in certain lore readings is that they do. Whether this is literally true in the game's mechanics is somewhat beside the point. What matters is that the narrative construction of the hunter's dream suggests an accumulation of dead hunters over a very long period. If Yharnam has been the warden of this place since before the events of the main game, then the graves represent a history that the player never gets to see. They are the record of everyone who came before you and didn't make it out. The workshop has a second floor that is accessible but largely empty. A few items are stored there, some of them in configurations that suggest they were placed deliberately rather than left behind by accident. The empty space is strange for a location that is otherwise very carefully dressed. Either something was removed from that space before the events of the game, or that space was always intended to be mostly empty, in which case its emptiness is itself a kind of message. What that message is, and who left it, is not clear. Yharnam's notebook, referenced in certain dialogue fragments and item descriptions, but never directly readable by the player, apparently contained observations about the nature of the hunt and the behaviour of hunters in the dream. The fact that it's referenced, but not shown, is a deliberate narrative choice. It means there is a document that exists within the fiction of the world that would answer several open questions, and that document has been withheld. Whether this is because its contents would be too destabilizing to the player's understanding, or simply because the developers chose to leave certain things unresolved, is a question about intent that the text itself can't answer. The doll's exact status inside the dream is one of the more philosophically interesting puzzles in the game. She describes herself as not alive, or not alive in the way the hunter is alive. But she moves, she speaks, she responds to changes in the environment and in the player's progress. Her self-description doesn't match her observable behaviour, and the game treats this discrepancy as something to note, rather than something to resolve. One possible reading is that the doll's self-description is accurate in some technical sense, that the game is using a very narrow definition of aliveness, one that excludes her by design. The hunter's dream is described in several lore sources as a place that was woven from the design of a particular person or force. The weaving metaphor is consistent across several item descriptions and dialogue fragments. What's interesting about it is the implication that the dream has a structure, that it didn't simply emerge, but was constructed according to a plan. If that's true, then everything in the dream, including the graves, the doll, the lantern, the empty second floor, was put there for a reason. The reasons are not all legible. The moon presence's specific interest in hunters, as opposed to scholars or beasts or any other category of person, is not fully explained. There are readings that frame the moon presence as a parasite that uses hunters to contain the old blood spread. There are readings that frame it as a collector of some kind, but the specific mechanism by which it selects and binds hunters is not described in any item text. Gehrman was the first, and something about Gehrman made him suitable, whether that something was a quality he possessed or a vulnerability he expressed is left open. The hunter's mark, the item you use to return to the dream during play, is described as a hunting tool that transcends life and death. This is a standard piece of gameplay framing. But the mark itself has a visual design that matches nothing else in the hunter's standard toolkit. It's older looking than the rest of the equipment. Its origin is attributed to the first hunters, but not to any specific craftsman. If the mark was made by Gehrman, the description should probably say so. The fact that it doesn't suggests either that Gehrman didn't make it, or that its origin is genuinely obscure even within the fiction. The nightmarish quality of the hunter's dream is easy to overlook because the space is presented as safe and familiar. But several elements of it, examined closely, don't behave the way a safe space should. The sky above the workshop shifts. The music, if you stop to listen to it without engaging in any activity, has layers that surface and recede in ways that are slightly unnerving. The garden outside the workshop has plants growing in patterns that recur in certain other spaces in the game associated with the Great Ones. These aren't obvious overlaps, but they're there. The relationship between insight and the dream's appearance is one of the more documented observations in the Bloodborne community. At certain insight thresholds, the crying woman can be heard in the dream. At others, the messengers behave differently. These changes are not explained in the text. They're simply present. The game is telling you that the dream is sensitive to something you're accumulating, and that sensitivity produces changes in the environment that nobody in the dream acknowledges or comments on. Whether Gehrman can perceive these changes and chooses not to mention them, or whether he genuinely cannot perceive them, is not resolved. The small hair ornament found in the hunter's dream is one of the most emotionally weighted items in the game. Its description places it in a context of grief and loss that clearly connects to Gehrman's history. But the specific loss it commemorates, the specific person it marks, is described in terms that could apply to more than one candidate. The community has largely settled on Maria as the most likely person, but the item description doesn't confirm this, and the choice to leave it ambiguous feels intentional rather than accidental. The grief is legible. Its object is not. Yharnam's combat behaviour when you choose to fight him rather than submit is a lore detail as much as a gameplay one. He fights like someone who has done this many times before, but who no longer finds it meaningful. His attack patterns have a quality of rote performance. He knows exactly what to do and does it without apparent passion. This could be read as the weariness of an immortal man who has killed many hunters before you, but it could also be read as someone performing a ritual they were trained for, rather than reacting to a genuine threat. The moon presence itself appears to have no language. It communicates through the dream's architecture, through the behaviour of the messengers, through environmental changes. It does not speak to you the way Yharnam does. This is unusual for a final antagonist. Most powerful entities in From Software games have at least some form of direct communication. The moon presence's silence is total, and that silence is either a statement about its nature, it is beyond communication in any form a human could receive, or it is a statement about its relationship with the player. It doesn't need to speak, because it has already arranged everything it needs. The first hunters, the ones whose graves ring the workshop, are described in various lore fragments as having been recruited from a specific class of person, not scholars, not clerics. People who already had a particular kind of awareness. People who could navigate the boundary between waking and dream without losing their sense of self. This is described as a practical quality, something that made them useful for the hunt. But it also implies that the hunt has always required a specific kind of person, and that the process of selecting hunters is older and more deliberate than the institutional structures of Yharnam suggest. The nature of the ecosystem, the way experience and power are stored in blood and can be collected from the place of death, is presented as a feature of the world rather than a mechanic. In other words, the game treats it as something that really happens in Yharnam. Blood holds echoes. People who die leave their echoes behind. This is described in item text as a property of blood that was discovered rather than invented. The question of who discovered it and under what circumstances is not answered. The first hunters used it, but whether they discovered it or were taught it is unclear. The workshop's collection of weapons includes some that have no corresponding tutorial. You find them, you can read their descriptions, but certain features of them are not explained by any NPC or item. This is true of the hunter's axe, the saw cleaver, several others. The game assumes you either already know how to use these things or that you'll figure it out. The lore implication is that hunters don't need to be taught. Something about the hunt, about the dream, about blood echoes, activates capacities that were already latent. Whether that activation is something the moon presence does deliberately or something that simply happens as a property of the system is not clear. The description of the hunter's dream as a safe harbour appears in one specific piece of dialogue and is immediately complicated by everything that surrounds it. Safe, compared to what? The waking world of Yharnam, yes, obviously, but also safe in the sense of unchanging, of static, of incapable of resolution. You cannot age in the dream. You cannot permanently die. You also cannot leave without permission. The safety is indistinguishable from imprisonment if you examine it closely enough. The question of whether previous hunters can remember being in the dream is touched on in fragments, but never resolved. Certain NPCs in the waking world speak in ways that suggest they have partial memories of the dream, or at least of experiences that could only have happened there. Whether this is intentional on the part of the dream's architecture, a design flaw in how it erases memories, or a sign that certain people have a resistance to the forgetting, is not explained. The first hunters were apparently capable of things that later hunters are not, or at least the descriptions of certain early techniques suggest capabilities that the game's standard hunter toolkit doesn't fully account for. This could be a sign that early hunters had access to different tools. It could also be a sign that early hunters had a different relationship with insight and blood, one that produced different kinds of ability. The progression from those early hunters to the hunters of the present game's era involves a loss of something, though what was lost and how it was lost is not stated. The messengers, the small figures that appear throughout the dream and the waking world to deliver items and provide services, have no clear origin story. They predate Gehrman in certain readings. They behave with a kind of cheerful civility that becomes unsettling once you start thinking about what they actually are. They're not beasts, they're not humans, they're not great ones. They occupy a category that the game's taxonomy doesn't quite cover, and their cheerfulness in the context of everything else happening in Yharnam is either reassuring or deeply wrong depending on your reading. The nightmare spaces that connect to the hunter's dream, specifically the nightmare frontier and the nightmare of Mensis, are structured as extensions of dream logic rather than as separate places. But they are not the hunter's dream. They operate under different rules. The fact that the dream exists alongside these other nightmare spaces without fully merging with them implies that the dream has a kind of boundary or integrity that the other nightmare spaces lack. Who maintains that boundary and why are not answered. The physical description of the workshop, the way certain beams catch the light, the way certain items have gathered dust while others remain clean, implies the passage of time within a space that is supposedly outside of time. This is either a visual inconsistency or a deliberate signal that the dream is not as outside time as it presents itself. If time passes in the dream, even slowly, then Gehrman has been there long enough to watch things accumulate and fade. The emotional weight of that, of centuries spent in a space that keeps the lights on but lets things gather dust, is not directly addressed but feels present in every conversation he has with you. The hunter's dream ends. This is the thing that most first-time players don't fully process. The dream is not permanent. Depending on the choice you make at the end of the game, the dream is either ended by you taking Gehrman's place, ended by you freeing Gehrman and taking flight, or consumed by something larger. In all three endings, the dream does not continue in the form you've experienced it. The space that was a refuge for hunters across an unspecified span of time simply stops. What that means for everything that existed within it, the doll, the messengers, the graves, is left unaddressed. The weapons in the workshop that cannot be picked up or equipped, the ones that are simply present as environmental details, are described in the lore as relics of early hunters. The fact that they cannot be used might be a technical limitation, or it might be a narrative one. If those weapons belong to hunters whose echoes haven't fully dissipated, or whose connection to the dream wasn't properly severed, then their inaccessibility might reflect something about their status. They're there, but they're not available. Like the hunters themselves, who are present in their effects, but absent from any direct interaction. The connection between Gehrman's physical condition, his age, his wheelchair, his injuries, and his time in the dream is deliberately ambiguous. He's clearly old, but the dream doesn't cause aging. He's clearly injured, but the dream can restore hunters who die in it. The specific nature of his deterioration within a space that should preserve him is not explained. One reading is that Gehrman's condition reflects the state of his mind rather than his body, that the dream mirrors the psychological state of its inhabitants in ways that have physical expressions. If that's true, then Gehrman's wheelchair is a manifestation of something he carries rather than something that happened to him. The question of whether the hunter's dream is unique or whether other dream spaces like it were created by other great ones is raised but not answered. The moon presence seems to be the architect of this particular configuration. But the existence of the nightmare realm suggests that the capacity to construct persistent dream spaces isn't unique to the moon presence. If other great ones can and did create similar refuges for similar purposes, then the history of Yharnam contains chapters that don't appear in any of the texts the player has access to. The first time you see Gehrman, he's asleep in the garden. He doesn't wake up to greet you. The doll brings you to him. And when he does speak to you, the first thing he says is phrased as if he's been expecting you, as if your arrival was anticipated rather than surprising. This is usually read as a sign of the cyclical nature of the hunt, that hunters arrive and are processed through the dream in a pattern that Gehrman has witnessed enough times to stop finding remarkable. But it could also be read as something more specific. He might know something about you in particular. What he knows and how he knows it is not explained. The graves, when examined closely, don't all face the same direction. Most burial conventions involve a consistent orientation. The graves outside the workshop are scattered in a way that suggests they were placed over time and in different circumstances rather than laid out according to a plan. This small detail implies that the burials were responsive rather than ceremonial, that someone dug the graves where the situation required rather than where a plan dictated. If the graves were created by Gehrman, then they represent his practical response to accumulating loss rather than a formal acknowledgement of it. The moon is always visible from the hunter's dream. It doesn't move, it doesn't cycle. It sits in the same position regardless of what happens in the waking world's sky. The moon presence is typically represented as having a particular relationship with the moon, though whether it is the moon or is connected to it or simply shares its symbolic resonance is one of the game's ambiguities. The dream static moon implies that whatever the moon presence is, its relationship with the dream is fixed and permanent in a way that the waking world's moon is not. The final conversation with Gehrman, the one that happens only if you don't accept his offer, reveals information about his history that isn't available anywhere else in the game. He speaks in fragments, with the cadence of someone who has said these things before and has stopped expecting them to be understood. The fragments he offers don't add up to a complete narrative. They add up to an impression of a narrative, one in which he made choices a long time ago that he hasn't been able to stop paying for. What specifically those choices were is something the game leaves in the gap between what he says and what it would mean if you pushed him further. The hunter's dream, as a concept, as a space that persists outside normal causality, raises the question of what happens to the echoes of hunters who die within it. Normally, echoes are left at the place of death and can be retrieved. But the dream is not a normal place. If you die in the dream, it's not clear whether your echoes remain there or whether they dissipate into the fabric of the dream itself. The messengers seem to operate on echoes in some way, whether they're harvesting the echoes of dead hunters or simply responding to them is not clarified. The note on Gehrman's worktable, visible but not fully readable in the standard camera angle, has been a subject of community interest since the game released. What's legible of it suggests a list or a record of some kind, whether it's a list of hunters, a record of events, or something else entirely is not established. The game places it in a position where the player can see it exists but can't comfortably read it, which is either an environmental storytelling choice, showing you that records were kept without revealing what they say, or simply a detail that wasn't intended to be fully readable. The plants in the hunter's dream garden respond to the player's movement. This is easy to attribute to standard interactive vegetation in game design. But the specific plants present in the dream garden are botanically associated in several lore descriptions with Pthumerian ritual spaces and with areas adjacent to the Old Blood's influence. Their presence in the dream garden either means that the dream was constructed partly from Pthumerian materials, or that the Old Blood's influence extends even into a space designed as a refuge from it. Neither option is comforting. The dream's persistence after death is the mechanic the entire game is built on, but the mechanism behind it is not fully explained in the lore. The mark allows the return. The dream receives the returning hunter. But the decision about when a hunter is truly dead, when they cannot return, is not described as a rule. It happens. Hunters die permanently. The dream decides or something in the dream decides when a hunter's number is up. Yharnam is the most likely agent of this decision, but he doesn't describe it in his dialogue, and the criteria aren't stated. The earliest entries in the workshop's visible records, the ones closest to Yharnam's original residency, are physically worn in ways that suggest very frequent handling. Someone went back to those documents repeatedly. The more recent records, relatively speaking, are less worn. The implication is that something in the early history of the workshop was consulted obsessively, and then, at some point, the consulting stopped. What was in those documents that required such frequent reference, and why that reference eventually became unnecessary, are questions the game raises through texture and environment rather than through text. The concept of the hunt, as it's described in the game's foundational lore, is not about killing beasts. The original purpose, or at least one possible reading of the original purpose, was something more like containment than elimination. The first hunters were not exterminators. They were custodians of a boundary between states of being. The shift from custodianship to extermination, from maintaining a balance to simply destroying what was on the wrong side of a line, is one of the historical trajectories the game implies without fully tracing. When that shift happened and what caused it are not explained. The hunter's dream ultimately functions as a trap. Whether or not it was designed as one is the question. If the moon presence designed it as a trap, then everything in it, the comfort, the safety, the ability to grow stronger, is bait. If Yharnam built it as a refuge and it became a trap through his own imprisonment, then the comfort is real, and the imprisonment is the contamination. The difference matters because it changes whether the kindness of the dream is genuine or performed, whether Yharnam is a host or a fellow prisoner, or both. The doll says something at a certain point in the game that can be interpreted as the only direct acknowledgement by any entity in the dream that the dream itself may not be benign. She says it gently, in her habitual register of careful warmth, in a way that is easy to hear as comfort. But the specific words she chooses, the specific framing she uses, open up a reading in which she's telling you something true and important that she knows you won't act on. Whether she knows this because she's been watching hunters for a very long time, or because something about her construction gives her insight into the dream's nature that other inhabitants don't have, is not resolved. The greatest unsolved mystery of the hunter's dream may not be any specific element of it, but the simpler question of why it works. Dreams in Bloodborne are not neutral spaces. They're shaped by the psychological residue of the people and entities associated with them. The hunter's dream should, by this logic, be saturated with Yharnam's grief and loss, and there are readings in which it is, in which every element of the dream reflects the interior state of the man who has been its anchor for centuries. But the dream also has a quality of orderliness, of function, of careful preparation that doesn't obviously fit a space shaped by unresolved grief. Either Yharnam's grief is more ordered than it appears, or something in the dream's construction is suppressing the emotional residue that would otherwise define it. Chapter 2. The Fumarian civilization and its true depth. What the game tells you about the Fumarians is the minimum necessary to contextualize the Chalice dungeons as a gameplay space. They lived underground. They were guardians of the old labyrinthine ruins. They had contact with the Great Ones. They're gone now. This is enough for the game to function. But as a description of a civilization, it is almost completely useless. The Fumarians are one of the most important forces in Bloodborne's world, and the game has chosen to reveal almost nothing about them. The Chalice dungeons are the remains of Fumarian architecture, and the architecture is doing significant narrative work even when the text is silent. The scale of these spaces is wrong in a specific way. They are built for something larger than human inhabitants. The ceilings are high, not in the way ceremonial architecture is high, to impress human visitors, but in the way a space is high when the beings using it are tall. The Fumarians, based on their surviving remains and enemy forms, were not consistently larger than humans. The scale of the architecture suggests that the spaces were built with another occupant in mind, or that the Pthumerians built for the beings they served rather than for themselves. The servants of the Pthumerians appear in the dungeons in a form that suggests they were never fully human. Their physiology includes elements that don't correspond to any recognizable human anatomy. Whether this means they were modified by Pthumerian practice, that they were already a non-human species that served the Pthumerians, or that proximity to whatever the Pthumerians were guarding changed them over generations is not established. The game gives you enemy types without giving you a genealogy. The specific rituals associated with the Chalice dungeons, the ones you perform to unlock the dungeon variants, involve blood and specific material components that are described in item text as preparations rather than as simple keys. The language used in those descriptions treats the ritual as a process of establishment, of creating conditions suitable for something rather than a process of opening. The difference matters. A key opens something that's already there. A preparation makes conditions appropriate for something that will come. Whether the rituals are opening pre-existing spaces or actively constructing the dungeon environments each time they're performed is not resolved. The Queen of the Pthumerians, Yharnam, is one of the most visually striking bosses in the game, and one of the least explained. Her title places her at the apex of a civilization. Her appearance, her behaviour during the boss fight, her location deep in the most challenging Chalice dungeon variant, all suggest extreme importance. But the lore surrounding her is sparse. We know she was pregnant. We know her child has significance to the Great Ones. We know the choir was seeking her. We know she's been there for a very long time. We don't know what she wanted. We don't know what she experienced. We don't know whether she is contained in those depths, or whether she remains there by choice. The child of Queen Yharnam is one of the most discussed figures in Bloodborne lore, and one of the most genuinely ambiguous. The Orphan of Kos is often invoked in this context, though the connection is more of an inference than a statement. If the orphan is Yharnam's child, then the mechanics of that lineage and the path that child took from the Pthumerian depths to the fishing hamlet are a story the game doesn't tell. If the orphan is not Yharnam's child, then the question of what the Great Ones wanted with her pregnancy becomes even less tractable. The Pthumerian descendant is one of the more physically interesting enemies in the dungeons. His movement patterns and weapon type suggest a training tradition that is distinct from the Hunter's Workshop and distinct from anything associated with Byrgenwerth. He fights like someone who was trained by people who had been fighting in these spaces for a very long time. Whether the descendant represents a surviving lineage of Pthumerian warriors or a later group of humans who adopted Pthumerian fighting techniques is not established. He is a practitioner of something. What he's practicing and why it persists in these spaces is unclear. The Gravestone Chalice dungeons present an environment that is meaningfully different from the other dungeon variants, not just visually, but in terms of the implied geography and the entities that appear there. The ruins suggest a connection to the celestial mobs and to a stage of the cosmos that the other dungeons don't explicitly access. If the Chalice dungeons are a network of interconnected spaces, then the variant occupies a different node in that network, one that connects to something farther out. What the Pthumerians were doing with access to that node, whether they were seeking something or containing it, is not described. The Lauren dungeons present the traces of another civilization that overlaid or preceded Pthumerian occupation in certain areas. The Lauren fragments reference a place called Lauren that was destroyed by beasts from the Old Blood before the events of the main game. The Pthumerians and the Loranians appear to have been distinct but connected. What the exact nature of that connection was, whether it was political, cultural, or simply geographic proximity to the same underground network, is not fully established. Two civilizations that both had contact with the Great Ones, and both left ruins behind in the same labyrinthine system, and the relationship between them is barely described. The trap mechanisms in the Chalice dungeons are sophisticated. This is easy to overlook because traps in dungeon crawling games are expected. But the specific types of traps present, the blade mechanisms, the pressure plates, the poison environments, represent a level of mechanical engineering that implies a developed technical tradition. The Pthumerians were not primitive. They had the engineering capacity to construct elaborate defensive systems in addition to the capacity to build large-scale ritual architecture. The coexistence of those two capabilities in a single civilization implies a level of organizational complexity that the game's minimal description of them doesn't account for. The oil urns found in certain dungeon configurations contain a substance described in terms that associate it with both the old blood and with a ritual preservation practice. Whether the Pthumerians used the oil as a defensive weapon, as a ritual preparation, or as a storage method for something they were trying to preserve is not established. The fact that it's flammable connects it to the hunter's practical toolkit. The fact that it appears in ritual contexts in the dungeons suggests it had a function beyond weaponization. What that function was is not stated. The Pthumerian elders, who appear as bosses in later dungeon configurations, are described as having a form of power that comes from a very long accumulation of something. Whether that something is blood echoes, insight, proximity to the Great Ones, or a Pthumerian-specific mechanism is not explained. Their age is implied to be extraordinary. If they have persisted in the dungeon spaces since the height of Pthumerian civilization, then they have been down there for a span of time that makes most of the game's other ancient figures look recent. What they've been doing in that time, and what has sustained them, is not described. The connection between the Pthumerians and the Vilebloods is one of the more explicitly stated relationships in the game's lore, but the mechanism of that connection remains partly unclear. The Vilebloods trace their origin to a particular type of blood that connects to the Great Ones and to the Pthumerian queens. The implication is that Annalise and her court are carrying something forward from the Pthumerian tradition. But the specific historical chain from Pthumerian practice to the Vileblood Covenant is missing several links. What happened between the fall of the Pthumerians and the establishment of the Vileblood court is not described. The hair ornaments and jewellery found in Pthumerian contexts are visually distinct from anything found in Yharnam's surface architecture. They belong to a different aesthetic tradition, one with different symbolic references. The symbols on certain Pthumerian artefacts don't correspond to any symbol system used by Björgenworth, the church, or the Hunter's Workshop. This is either because the Pthumerian symbol system has been lost, or because it's deliberately excluded from the frame of reference that the surface institutions operate in. If the latter, then someone decided that Pthumerian symbolic knowledge was something that should not be integrated into the surface world's practices, which itself implies a judgment about what that knowledge contained. The Great Ones associated most specifically with the Chalice dungeons are the Ailing Lauren Chalice entities and the deeper amygdala variants. The amygdala's presence in both surface Yharnam and deep dungeon contexts suggests that it occupies multiple positions in whatever hierarchy or ecology the Great Ones inhabit. Whether the amygdala that appears in the dungeons is the same entity as the ones clinging to Cathedral Ward's rooftops, or whether they're distinct instances of the same type, is a question the game raises through the repetition of the design, without explicitly addressing. The Pthumerian watchdogs are among the most ancient-seeming enemies in the dungeon environments. Their design implies a long period of transformation or deterioration from a prior form. Whether that form was human, proto-Pthumerian, or something else entirely is not established. They don't fight with the intelligence of trained warriors. They fight with the persistence of something that has been doing one thing for a very long time. What they were set to guard, and whether they remember the instructions they were given, or simply execute them by reflex, is not described. The specific placement of certain treasure items in the dungeon environments suggests that they were hidden rather than simply stored. The difference between hiding something and storing it is the expectation of retrieval. Something stored is meant to be found again by the person who stored it or by their designees. something hidden is being removed from access. Several of the dungeon treasures are in locations that suggest they were being kept from someone rather than being preserved for someone. Who was being kept from what and why are not described. The torch in the dungeon environments has a specific behaviour that differs from the torch behaviour in surface Yharnam. The dungeons are designed so that certain torch variants are necessary for revealing what's actually in certain spaces, not just for lighting, but for visibility of particular elements. Whether this is a gameplay mechanic or a lore statement about the nature of the dungeon environments, specifically that some things in them can only be perceived under specific conditions, is ambiguous. If it's a lore statement, then the Pthumerians understood that their spaces contained things that required a particular kind of perception to interact with. The Pthumerian bloodline, to the extent it can be traced, appears to have produced individuals with varying degrees of exposure to Great One influence across generations. Some Pthumerians appear to have been largely human in form and function. Others show signs of having been close enough to the Great Ones for long enough that something fundamental about them changed. Whether this was a feature of Pthumerian society, a deliberate practice of transformation through proximity, or simply the inevitable consequence of living adjacent to entities that change everything around them, is not established. The runic writing found throughout the dungeon environments appears in patterns that several researchers have connected to the hunter runes available in the game. If the dungeon runes and the hunter runes are the same system or related systems, then the knowledge encoded in those runes originates with or passes through the Pthumerians. The hunter runes are described as revelations rather than inventions, as things that were discovered in the old labyrinth. This would make the Pthumerians the original keepers of a body of knowledge that the hunter system has inherited in fragments. The sinister chalice dungeon variants are described in their ritual materials as involving a specific kind of risk that the standard dungeons don't present. The sinister designation implies that the conditions created by the ritual are in some way inverted or wrong. What constitutes wrong in the context of a Pthumerian ritual space, a space already defined by proximity to cosmic horror, is not explained. The sinister variants produce different enemy configurations and have a different atmospheric quality. Whether this is because the ritual is performed incorrectly or because it's performed correctly and produces something genuinely more dangerous than the standard is not clarified. The fluid that appears in certain ritual pools in the chalice dungeons is described in terms that associate it with both blood and with something that is not blood. It has properties that blood doesn't have. It behaves differently. Whether this is a modification of blood produced by Pthumerian practice or a substance that predates blood's presence in the dungeon environments is not established. The pools are clearly significant sites. What happens in them and what the Pthumerians used them for is described only in the broadest terms. The connection between the chalice dungeons and the Great Is suggests that the Pthumerians had access to a navigational system that extended beyond what any surface institution achieved. The ability to build ritual spaces that connect to specific Great One domains implies either that the Pthumerians understood the topology of the cosmos in a way that Byrgenwerth was still trying to achieve, or that they were guided by the Great Ones themselves in constructing those connections. Neither option positions the Pthumerians as purely passive recipients of cosmic proximity. They were doing something deliberate. The Keeper of the Old Lords is an entity in the dungeon environments that the game's lore places in a very specific role, without explaining how that role was established or what it entails. The title implies both age and a specific function, keeping something. What is being kept, what keeping means in this context, and who or what the Keeper reports to or defers to are all unanswered. The entity itself doesn't communicate in any direct way. Its hostility is the only information it offers about its current state. The Grave Warden enemies in the Chalice dungeons are described as descendants of Pthumerian grave tenders. The specification that they tend graves implies a mortuary practice, a specific relationship with death that was important enough to constitute a hereditary occupation. What the Pthumerians' relationship with their own dead was, whether they had beliefs about the afterlife or about the persistence of identity after death, and how those beliefs connected to their proximity to the Great Ones, are questions that the grave tender designation raises without answering. The Pthumerian civilization's end is described in fragments. Something happened. The civilization fell. The dungeons remained. The entities that were in the dungeons when the civilization fell remained in the dungeons. The surface world developed above the ruins without apparently being aware of them until Byrgenwerth began excavating. The specific mechanism of the fall, whether it was a collapse from within due to the effects of proximity to the Great Ones, a catastrophic event like what happened to Lauren, or simply a very gradual dissolution over time, is not described in any coherent narrative. The fall is implied by the ruins. The reason for the fall is not given. The Pthumerian scale, in terms of how many people and how many generations the civilization represented, is also not described. The dungeon environments are extensive, but they could represent centuries of construction, or they could represent a very intensive period of building by a large population. Without knowing the scale of the civilization, it's impossible to assess the scale of what was lost when it fell. The game gives you the architecture. It doesn't give you the demographics. The layered ritual protocols required for accessing the deepest Chalice dungeon variants suggest that the Pthumerians operated on a principle of nested authentication, that access to the deepest truths of their system required demonstrating the ability to navigate each layer of the outer system first. Whether this was a safety mechanism, ensuring that only those with sufficient preparation could reach the most dangerous spaces, or an organizational structure reflecting genuine hierarchy of importance, is not established. The rituals are demanding. What makes the deepest spaces worth the demand is partly shown and partly left to interpretation. The relationship between the Pthumerians and the surface world of Yharnam before the excavations began is unclear. Was there ever contact? Did the Pthumerians choose to be underground, or were they driven there? Did the surface world develop in ignorance of the underground network? Or were they in some kind of communication? The excavations by Byrgenwerth scholars are described as discoveries, implying genuine ignorance on the part of the surface. But the old blood that Byrgenwerth found was already present. The system was already there. The Pthumerians were already ancient. The meeting between surface and underground was not the first time those two worlds touched. It was just the first time that the surface world realized what it was touching. The blood-tinged stat in the game's mechanics is associated specifically with certain Pthumerian weapon types, and with the Vile Blood Covenant. Whether this is coincidence, or whether blood tinge as a capacity has a specific origin in Pthumerian blood practice, is not described. If it does have such an origin, then the Vile Bloods are not simply inheritors of a tradition, but carriers of a biological capacity that the Pthumerians developed or cultivated over their civilization's history. The implications of that for how the Vile Bloods are positioned in relation to the Church and the Hunters are significant. The cold abyssal hunter variant of certain dungeon bosses occupies a space in the dungeon environment that suggests it arrived there from somewhere else, or that it exists in the dungeon as a remnant of something that visited rather than something that originated there. Its design language is different from standard Pthumerian enemy types, whether it represents a hunter from a different time period who entered the dungeon system and became trapped and transformed, or whether it represents a Pthumerian variant of the hunter archetype, or whether it's something else entirely, is not established. The question of what the Pthumerians worshipped, or whether worship is even the right word for their relationship with the Great Ones, is approached obliquely in the lore. The word reverence appears more often than worship in descriptions of Pthumerian religious practice. The distinction might be meaningful. Reverence implies recognition of something's greatness without necessarily implying a supplicant relationship. If the Pthumerians revered the Great Ones rather than worshipping them, then the nature of the relationship was different from what the church established with its blood ministration. It might have been closer to the relationship between a keeper and a kept thing, which would reframe the entire question of who was serving whom. The Pthumerian queen's physical condition during the boss encounter in the deepest chalice dungeon raises questions about the nature of her persistence. She is clearly ancient. She is clearly suffering. She is also clearly powerful in ways that don't require her to be in optimal physical condition. Whether she has been in this state since the Pthumerian civilization's fall, or whether something specific happened to her that put her in this condition, is not described. The game places her at the bottom of the deepest accessible dungeon in a state of terrible endurance. What she's enduring, and why she remains there rather than dying or escaping, are not answered. The Chalice Dungeon enemies that appear to be in various states of incomplete transformation suggest that the dungeon environments are still active in some sense, still producing or altering the beings within them, even without Pthumerian civilization to oversee the process. If the dungeons are still doing something to their inhabitants, then the ruins are not inert, they are ongoing. The Pthumerians may be gone, but the system they built continues to operate according to principles they established. Whether those principles are working correctly, whether the transformations now happening in the dungeons are what the Pthumerians intended, or whether the system has drifted from its original design without anyone to manage it, is not answered. The specific items that can only be found in Pthumerian contexts, and that have no analogue in the surface world's item set, represent a body of Pthumerian material culture that the game makes available for use while withholding the context that would make them fully interpretable. You can use them. You can read their descriptions. The descriptions place them in a tradition that is described in fragments. The full picture of what the Pthumerians made and why they made it is assembled from those fragments, and the assembly is always incomplete. The light sources in the Chalice dungeons are one of the details that most clearly separate the dungeon aesthetic from the surface aesthetic. The surface world uses oil lamps and torches and gas lighting. The dungeons use something else. The specific light sources in the dungeon environments are not explained in the item descriptions. They predate oil lamps. They predate whatever fuel technology the surface world uses. Whether they're magical in a specific Pthumerian sense, physical in some way that the game doesn't expose, or simply an environmental detail that was designed for atmosphere without lore implications, is not established. The Pthumerian Elders' specific attacks involve a form of energy manipulation that doesn't correspond to anything described as possible for standard human practitioners. The energy they deploy has a visual quality that connects it to arcane power and to the cosmic, rather than to the earthly. Whether this means the Pthumerian Elders developed their own access to cosmic power through long proximity to the Great Ones, or whether they are channeling a form of power granted to them, or whether they are simply very old and the accumulation of exposure has changed what they're capable of, is not established in the text. The most disturbing reading of the Pthumerian civilization is the one in which their guardianship of the Great Ones was not a voluntary arrangement. If the Pthumerians were shaped by, or conscripted by the Great Ones for the purpose of maintaining the dungeon network, then their civilization was not independent. It was managed. The architecture they built, the rituals they practiced, the hierarchy they maintained, all of it would be the operational structure of a custodial species, rather than the self-directed development of a culture. The Pthumerians, as willing devotees of the Great Ones, is one reading. The Pthumerians, as a civilization that was constructed for a purpose by something that needed them, is another, and the game provides enough ambiguity to leave both open. Chapter 3, The Orphan of Kos and the Shore That Shouldn't Exist, the Fishing Hamlet, is the place in Bloodborne that most clearly shows you what happens when the cosmic touches the terrestrial, and neither one comes out of it intact. It is a ruin at the edge of the world, populated by people who are no longer people, soaked in the remains of a great one that washed up on its shore, and it is the location of one of the most unsettling boss fights in the game, precisely because the thing you're fighting is not evil. It is simply grief, made manifest and incoherent. The hunters who came to the fishing hamlet before you, the ones from the Bergenworth era who preceded the main game's timeline, are described as having committed something there. The word used in relation to their presence is not discovery, it's violation. What happened at the fishing hamlet in that earlier period is described in fragments across several item descriptions and in the behaviour of the hamlet's remaining inhabitants. The fishermen curse you. They curse the hunters. The curse is specific, and it's old. Whatever happened there, the survivors or their descendants are still processing it. Kos is described as a great one who washed ashore. This is an unusual origin for a great one. The game's other great ones are associated with the cosmos, with heights and depths, with spaces that are above or below the human scale. They don't wash ashore. The specific word, washed, implies that Kos travelled through a medium that could carry her to a shore, and that when she arrived she was either dead or dying. Whether Kos came to the shore deliberately, was driven there, or arrived by accident is not described. She found the place, or the place found her. The parasite that the fishermen of the hamlet ingested as a form of communion with Kos is one of the most directly described elements of the hamlet's lore, and also one of the most unsettling. They ate something from the Great One. They did this as a religious act. The result was transformation of a kind that made them what they are now, which is to say not entirely what they were. Whether this transformation was what the fishermen expected, whether it gave them what they wanted from the communion, or whether the outcome was something else entirely is not established in the text. The Orphan of Kos appears as the last boss of the Dilk and fights you on the shore where Kos washed up. The Orphan is connected to Kos's body, which is lying on the beach in a state that could be described as dead, but which the Orphan's tether to it complicates. Kos is dead enough to have been studied and pillaged by the hunters. She is not dead in a way that severs her child from her. The nature of the connection between the Orphan and Kos's body, specifically what that connection consists of and what it means for the Orphan's existence, is not described in terms that resolve to a single reading. The weapon the Orphan carries, the placenta, is both the most grotesque and the most narratively significant element of the boss fight. He was born holding it. He fights with it. Its weapon description, when you receive it after the fight, attributes to it a connection to lost umbilical cords and to the possibility of transcendence. The umbilical cord in Bloodborne is consistently associated with access to higher states of being. The Orphan's cord is a weapon. Whether that means the Orphan is using the means of transcendence as an instrument of destruction, or whether the placenta weapon is simply expressing what he is in physical form, is left to interpretation. The screaming. The Orphan screams. He screams in a way that communicates something, though what he's communicating is not language. It communicates loss in the most direct possible way. Whether the Orphan is screaming because he's just been born, because Kos is dead, because the hunters who pillaged this place are still here in the form of you, or because his existence is simply an experience of grief, is not specified. The scream is information. The information is not organised into a statement that can be passed. The fishing hamlet fishermen who attack you are not entirely hostile in the standard enemy sense. Their attacks feel reflexive, defensive, protective. They're not patrolling for something to kill. They're still here, still on the shore where the violation happened, still responding to the presence of someone who looks like a hunter. Whether they can distinguish between the hunters who came before and you, the hunter who comes now, is not clear. Whether it matters to them is even less clear. The curse they lay on you applies regardless. The curse of Kos is described in the DLC's narrative as being directed at hunters. But the curse doesn't specify which hunters. It doesn't differentiate between the hunters who participated in the original violation and every hunter who comes after. Whether this is because Koss's curse lacks precision, because all hunters are implicated by their participation in the hunt's institutional history, or because the curse was always intended to apply to the category rather than the individuals, is not established. You bear a curse that belongs to someone else's history, and the game doesn't absolve you of it. Lady Maria's presence in the fishing hamlet, or rather in the clock tower adjacent to the DLC's main content, connects her history to what happened at the hamlet. The exact nature of her involvement in the original transgression is described in terms that suggest deep complicity followed by deep remorse. She was there. She participated. She couldn't undo it. The specific act she participated in and the specific form of her guilt are described in ways that are emotionally clear but historically vague. You understand what she feels. The action that produced those feelings is not fully described. The hunter's nightmare, the space in which the dilk takes place, is described as being born from the crimes committed at the fishing hamlet. The nightmare is punishment, and it is also containment. The hunters who committed the transgression there were pulled into a space where they would continue to hunt forever, where their violence would become self-referential and pointless. The nightmare is a perfect punishment for hunters, an endless hunt with no purpose. Whether this was Koss's design, or the design of the Great One she calls upon in her last moment, if she calls upon anything, is not described. The celestial larvae that appear in certain areas of the DLC and that connect to the messengers and to the Great One's reproductive strategies are one of the details that make the hamlet's history feel cosmically significant rather than simply tragic. The larvae suggest that Koss was not merely a casualty. She was in the process of something. The scholars who found her body and studied it found something about her biology that was relevant to their research. What specifically they extracted beyond the umbilical cord fragments and what they learned from it is not fully described. The relationship between Koss and the fisherman before the scholars arrived is one of the implied histories of the hamlet that the game doesn't directly describe. They lived with her, they communed with her. Whether Koss was aware of them and their relationship to her, whether she chose to share the shore with them or simply existed there, and they organised themselves around her presence, is not established. The fisherman's transformation through the parasite suggests that Koss affected them biologically, whether or not she intended to. Whether intention is a concept that applies to a Great One's effects on the world around them is itself an open question. The shark-like enemies in the hamlet are among the more disturbing transformations present in the DLC. They suggest that the fisherman's communion with Koss produced divergent outcomes, that some became more fish-like while others remained more humanoid. Whether this divergence was a function of how much parasite they consumed, when they consumed it, their individual biology, or some other variable is not described. The spectrum of transformation in the hamlet implies that the process is not controlled and not uniform, that the communion produced different things in different people without any clear principle governing the differences. The note that can be found in the hamlet describing the fisherman's perspective on what happened to them is one of the more directly human documents in the DLC. It describes the transformation not as suffering, but as gift. At the time of writing, at least, the person writing it believed that what Koss had given them was something they wanted. Whether that belief persisted as the transformation progressed is not described. The document is a snapshot of a moment in the process. What came after the note was written is shown in the form of what the hamlet's inhabitants have become. The moon over the fishing hamlet has a quality that is described in some lore readings as being directly connected to Koss. The moon in Bloodborne is associated with the moon presence. If the moon over the hamlet is connected to Koss rather than to the moon presence, or if Koss has a different relationship with the moon than the moon presence does, then the hamlet is operating under a different cosmic authority than the rest of Yharnam. Whether the moon presence's domain extends to the fishing hamlet, or whether the hamlet is a space that belongs to Koss's influence specifically, is not resolved. The scholars from Bergenworth who came to the hamlet are described as having found Kos there in a state that made study possible. But the description of their study involves extraction, which implies that Kos had something they could take. What they took and what they did with it connects to the broader history of Bergenworth's research program. If what they extracted from Kos's body contributed to the development of the Healing Church's blood ministration, then the founding act of Yharnam's entire religious medical system involved the violation of a Great One's body. That's a foundation with significant implications for everything built on it. The Rakio, Lady Maria's weapon, connects her personally to the history of the hamlet and to something about the place that she tried to leave behind. She throws the weapon away during her boss fight, or rather she stops using it and fights with her blood instead. The abandonment of a weapon in favour of blood in a DLC whose central mystery involves blood and a dead Great One and violation is not incidental. Maria is doing something in that fight that is not just combat. What she's doing and what it means to her are described through action rather than text, which is to say they're present, but they require interpretation. The relationship between the orphan's grief and the game's treatment of the Great Ones more generally is one of the DLC's most significant contributions to the overall lore. The Great Ones elsewhere in the game are presented as beyond human emotion, as operating on a scale and according to principles that don't include feeling. The orphan doesn't fit this framing. He grieves, whether this is because he's newborn and hasn't yet developed into the cold cosmic entity that adult Great Ones seem to be, or because his specific circumstances, born to a dead mother, born into a world that killed her, produce a human-scale emotional response in a non-human entity, is not established. He is the Great One, who can be understood, and what he understands is loss. The specific items dropped by the Orphan of Kos, and by other enemies in the Dilk, connect to a system of Great One biology and reproduction that the main game gestures toward, but doesn't fully develop. The Dilk is the place where the game most directly shows you what a Great One looks like in biological, rather than cosmic terms. Kos's body on the shore, the parasite, the placenta weapon, the umbilical cord, these are the bodily remnants of a cosmic being, and they're described with a specificity that the game's other Great One encounters don't match. What that specificity tells you about the nature of the Great Ones, and whether it should change how you understand Murgo, the wet nurse, the moon presence, is something the player has to work out without explicit guidance. The Hunter's Nightmare as a punishment space raises the question of what happens to the hunters who are already there when you arrive. They're still hunting. They're still moving through the nightmare version of Yharnam. Some of them can speak, some of them remember things, whether they experience the nightmare as punishment or simply as continuation. Whether they know what they're in, or whether they believe themselves to be in the waking world, is not resolved. The nightmare contains people who might be suffering, might be unaware, might be something in between, and the game doesn't specify. The connection between the nightmare and the real geography of Yharnam is another source of unresolved questions. The nightmare contains versions of places that also exist in the waking world. But the versions are wrong. They're reconfigured. Things are in places they shouldn't be. The layout doesn't map cleanly onto the waking Yharnam. Whether this is because the nightmare was constructed from imperfect memories of the waking world, because the nightmare has its own internal logic that doesn't correspond to the waking world's geography, or because the nightmare is showing you what Yharnam looked like at a different time, is not established. The fishing hamlet's location, at what appears to be the coast of a sea that doesn't clearly connect to any described geography of the Yharnam region, is one of the details that places the DLC in a specific relationship with the main game. The hamlet is real, or was real. It exists in physical space. But where that physical space is relative to Yharnam City, how close or how far away, is not mapped. The hamlet is near enough that hunters from Bergenworth travelled to it, and that the DLC space was accessible from within the nightmare. The specific geography that would tell you how the hamlet relates to the rest of the world is absent. The silence on the shore during the orphan fight, specifically the moments between the orphan's screams, has a quality that is different from the silence in other areas of the game. It's not the silence of emptiness, it's the silence of something that used to be full. The shore feels like a place that was, for a long time, inhabited in a particular way, and that the current state of it is a state of aftermath rather than of ordinary emptiness. What the shore was like before Cost died, before the scholars came, before the transformation of the fisherman, is something the game implies through the contrast between that silence and everything that surrounds it. Chapter 4. The eyes of the unseen and what they do to you in sight is one of the most important mechanics in Bloodborne, and also one of the most genuinely unexplained. The game gives you a number. The number goes up when you encounter new things, when you use certain items, when you demonstrate certain kinds of experience. The number changes what you can perceive. It changes your behaviour, your statistics, your resistance to certain effects. It changes what the world looks like and what you can interact with within it. The game does not clearly explain what insight is, where it comes from, what the mechanism of perception change is, or why gaining it has the effects it does. The closest thing to a definition that the game offers is in the description of the item that grants it, the madman's knowledge. That description references the eyes on the inside of the skull, which is a strange image for several reasons. Eyes inside a skull are not visible to the outside world. They perceive, but are not perceived. They're turned inward. Whether this is meant literally, the creature that drops Madman's knowledge had developed actual eyes on the interior of its skull, or metaphorically, insight represents a capacity for a kind of inward-directed perception, is not established. The image is striking enough to feel intentional and ambiguous enough to resist a single reading. At low insight, the world looks and sounds a particular way. At higher insight thresholds, things change. You can hear crying in the hunter's dream. You can see the amygdala clinging to cathedral wards' rooftops. You can perceive a layer of the world that was there all along, but that required a certain accumulation of experience to access. Whether this is described in the lore as a feature of insight, as something the game intends you to understand as part of the world's rules, or whether it's simply a mechanical system that wasn't fully annotated with lore, is not clear. The effects are real within the game. The explanation for them is minimal. The amygdala's visibility threshold is one of the most discussed examples of insight's effects. The creatures are massive. They're sitting on the rooftops of a major area of the game. Before a certain insight level, you cannot see them. After that level, they are unmissable. The game presents this as a perceptual shift in the player character rather than as the amygdala appearing or arriving. They were always there. You gain the capacity to see them. What it means to be incapable of seeing something that large until you have accumulated enough experience to perceive it is a statement about the nature of perception in this world that goes beyond standard game mechanics. The relationship between insight and madness is one of the game's most consistently described connections. Gaining insight is described as accumulating something that can destabilize the mind. The frenzied enemies who have clearly been broken by something, the scholars who went too far, the characters in the game whose sanity is described as compromised, are associated with very high levels of insight, or with the acquisition of it, under conditions that didn't allow for processing. Whether insight drives you mad by showing you true things that the mind can't handle, or whether the mechanism is more physical, a literal change in the brain, is not specified. The brain suckers, the enemies that reduce your insight on contact, are one of the game's most unsettling enemy types for reasons that go beyond their appearance. They take something from you when they touch you. That something is a statistic, yes, but within the fiction of the world, they're removing a capacity for perception. Whether they're doing this because they need insight for some purpose, because they're designed to protect something from being perceived by two insightful hunters, or because they're simply attracted to insight the way scavengers are attracted to concentrated resources, is not established. The mechanism of the removal is also not described. They take it from you in a way that the game represents as a physical interaction. What actually happens in that interaction at the level of the world's rules is not addressed. The insight threshold at which the environment of the game starts sounding different, specifically the addition of a layer of what sounds like whispering or wailing to the ambient audio, is not described in any item text. It simply happens. The game adds a layer of audio that wasn't there before and doesn't comment on it. Whether this is intended as a representation of what it's actually like in Yharnam at night, that there are sounds that only certain people can hear, or whether it's a psychological experience of the player character rather than an objective feature of the environment, is ambiguous. The game doesn't distinguish between objective perception and subjective experience in this context. The frenzy mechanic, which is connected to certain enemies and certain locations, operates on a principle that insight affects. Higher insight increases vulnerability to frenzy. The implication is that being more perceptive, being more open to seeing what's actually there, makes you more susceptible to the specific kind of trauma that frenzy represents. Whether that's because frenzy operates on the perceptual capacity itself, burning out the very faculty you've developed, or because high insight individuals are perceiving more of what causes frenzy and the damage is simply proportional to exposure, is not described. The communion rune, which increases your maximum insight capacity, is described in terms that associate it with proximity to the Great Ones and with a specific kind of benefit that the Great Ones are described as conferring on those they favour. The implication is that insight is not simply accumulated human experience, but something that has a source outside the human. The Great Ones provide it, whether they provide it because they want humans to be able to perceive them, because the perception is itself useful to the Great Ones, or because insight is a byproduct of contact with them rather than a deliberate gift is not clarified. The relationship between insight and the ability to use certain items in the game is one of the mechanical expressions of the system that has the clearest lore implication. Certain actions require a minimum insight level. The implication is that those actions involve perceiving or interacting with something that requires a certain perceptual capacity to engage with. The actions that require insight are not randomly distributed. They cluster around interactions with the Great One's domain. Whether this means those actions require the perceiver to be able to process Great One-related phenomena, or simply that the system was designed to gate certain content behind progression, is a question about intent that the text doesn't resolve. The effect of insight on the moon during the Blood Moon event in the game is one of the more directly observable environment changes associated with the mechanic. The Blood Moon is a specific story event that changes the appearance of Yharnam's sky. High insight players see this differently from low insight players. Whether this means that the Blood Moon has different visual properties depending on who is looking at it, or whether the Blood Moon's full visual character is only accessible to high insight individuals and everyone else is seeing a reduced version of it, is not established. The Blood Moon is a real event in the game world. What it looks like to different people within that world is apparently variable. The insight shop in the Hunter's Dream, where messengers offer you items in exchange for insight rather than echoes, is one of the more philosophically interesting elements of the system. You're trading perceptual capacity for material goods. Whether this is a normal exchange within the dream's economy, a system Gehrman designed to give hunters access to tools they wouldn't otherwise have, or a mechanism that the moon presence benefits from in some way, perhaps by receiving the insight you trade away, is not described. The messengers are accepting something from you. What they do with it is not shown. The item description for the 1/3 of umbilical cord, when read in conjunction with descriptions of insight and the various events of the main game, suggests that the accumulation of insight across a playthrough is connected to a process of preparation for a specific kind of encounter. The cord is described as being connected to the ability to face the true danger of the night of the hunt. The insight you've accumulated throughout the game is part of what makes that encounter possible. Whether this means the encounter requires a perceiver at a certain level, or whether the insight you carry affects how the encounter goes, is not fully explained. The old hunters and their specific relationship with insight, the ones who were active in the period before the main game's events, are described in fragments as having a different relationship with the perceptual system than later hunters did. Whether they accumulated insight more quickly, more slowly, with different effects, or whether the system worked the same way for them and the differences in their experience were produced by other variables, is not established. The history of how insight worked before the main game's night, if it worked at all in the same way, is not described. The specific enemies that grant insight upon first encounter and the ones that grant it upon killing are not distributed randomly. The distribution implies a principle about which encounters constitute the kind of experience that produces insight. Encountering a new thing that is significant enough, killing a thing that is difficult or important enough, both produce insight. Whether the mechanism is experiential, the shock of the new perception, or biological, contact with something that produces a measurable change, or cosmic, the Great Ones marking an experience as significant by depositing insight in response to it, is not described. The moment in the game when insight allows you to see the messengers more clearly, to see them as they actually are, rather than as the small cheerful figures they present as at low insight, is one of the more disturbing perceptual thresholds. The messengers are not different. Your perception of them changes. What you see at higher insight is presumably more accurate. Whether the messengers are aware that high insight hunters perceive them differently, and whether this awareness affects their behaviour, is not addressed. They continue to be cheerful. What they actually are, and how they feel about being seen, is not something the text accounts for. The connection between insight and the ability to use certain gestures that affect the game world is another mechanical detail with lore implications. Certain gestures are described as having power beyond their social function. The capacity to perform them effectively is associated with insight. Whether this means the gestures are physically or perceptually demanding in a way that requires developed insight to execute, or whether the power they have is simply inaccessible to those without sufficient perceptual development, is not explained. Gestures as actions with literal effect in the world of Bloodborne are a small but persistent theme in the lore. The Celestial Emissary, as a boss, is associated with insight in a way that distinguishes it from most other bosses. Its description, and its position in the game's progression, suggest that it represents a specific stage in a process of cosmic contact. What it is, and what it represents, is associated with the potential for enlightenment, and with the specific costs of pursuing that enlightenment. Whether it's a guardian of something, a manifestation of the insight system itself, or a creature that has been transformed by proximity to whatever produces insight, is not established in a way that resolves the question. The reading of insight as fundamentally corrupting, as something that increases capability while also destabilizing the person who carries it, is the most consistently supported reading in the game's text. But there's a competing reading in which insight is described as genuinely valuable, as something the Great Ones offer as a benefit, and that certain scholars sought specifically because it was beneficial. Whether these two readings describe different stages of the same process, different amounts of insight, or fundamentally different frameworks for understanding what insight is and does, is not resolved. The game presents both and doesn't adjudicate between them. The player's insight counter, the number that increments and decrements throughout the game, represents something about the character that is not standard experience. Standard games have you accumulate experience that represents growing skill. Insight represents growing perception. The distinction matters because perception is not skill. You can have the capacity to see something without knowing what to do with what you see. Whether the game's version of insight development, the way it gates certain perceptions behind accumulated experience, accurately represents what it would actually be like to develop such perception, is a question about game design philosophy that the lore doesn't address but that feels present in the design. The question of whether insight is permanent or whether it can be fully lost is one of the mechanics as lore details that the game partially addresses. The brain suckers reduce it, certain items restore it. Death in certain circumstances might affect it. But the question of whether a hunter could have their insight reduced to zero and lose all the perceptual changes they've accumulated, returning to the state they were in at the start, is not addressed directly. The implication of the system is that insight, once gained to a certain level, produces changes that are not fully reversible. What that means for the hunter who has seen things they can no longer unsee is not described. The end of the game, in the Transcendence ending, involves the player character consuming the eyes of a Great One and experiencing a transformation that is described as the result of having accumulated sufficient insight. The specific mechanism by which insight prepared you for that transformation, what insight did to you throughout the game that made you capable of this specific outcome, is one of the most significant unanswered questions in the entire narrative. The accumulation of a number throughout the game is the preparation for a cosmic event. The preparation is shown. The mechanism isn't. Chapter 5. The Great Ones and what they actually want the Great Ones are the source of everything in Bloodborne. The old blood comes from them. The hunt exists because of them. The institutions of Yharnam were organised around accessing or containing them. And despite their centrality to the entire game, what any individual Great One actually wants is almost never stated directly. They communicate through effects. They communicate through the changes they produce in the world and in the people near them. They do not speak, with very few exceptions, and the exceptions are cryptic. Understanding what they want requires reading their behaviour rather than their words, and their behaviour is interpretable in multiple conflicting ways. The moon presence is the Great One most directly connected to the main events of the game and possibly the least explained. It appears in one of the three endings and is the force that controls the hunter's dream. Its relationship with Yharnam is described without the terms of that relationship being made clear. It wants hunters. It creates the conditions under which hunters operate. Beyond that, the game's descriptions of its motivations are almost entirely absent. One reading frames it as a parasite, feeding on the hunt's violence in a way that serves its survival. Another reading frames it as a preserver of sorts, using the hunt to contain the spread of the old blood. Both readings are partial. Murgo is a Great One that cannot be directly observed, or at least what can be observed of Murgo is described as a vestige. The wet nurse fights you in an empty space above a bloodied crib, protecting something that isn't visibly present. Murgo's cries can be heard. Murgo's effects on the Mensis scholars are described in the lore. But Murgo itself is a Great One that exists primarily as a described phenomenon rather than an observable entity. What Murgo wants, what Murgo is doing in the Nightmare of Mensis, and what would happen if Murgo were to develop fully from a vestige into something more complete, is not described. The Wet Nurse is one of the most visually arresting boss designs in the game, and one of the most narratively minimal. She protects Murgo. That's the function assigned to her. Whether this protection is a role she chose, a role she was created for, or a role she was coerced into, is not established. Whether she has awareness of anything beyond the immediate protective function, whether she has preferences or experiences that extend beyond the single behaviour the player witnesses, is not addressed. She is entirely defined by her function. Whether she exists beyond that function is not shown. Rom the vacuous spider is described in terms that place her in the role of a guardian of a secret. She hides the truth of the blood moon. Her presence in Bergenroth implies that she was placed there by the scholars or arrived there in connection with their research. But the specific truth she hides, the mechanism by which she hides it, and what would happen to that truth if she were removed from her position, all of which occur when you kill her, are described in ways that don't completely clarify the situation. She blocks something. You remove the block. The thing she was blocking becomes visible, but the relationship between her existence and the event she was suppressing is not described as a mechanism. The celestial emissary's position in the game's Great One hierarchy is not clearly established. Emissary suggests a role of communication or representation. Whether the celestial emissary is a representative of the Great Ones more generally, a representative of a specific Great One, or an entity that has been granted emissary status for purposes that aren't described, is not established in the lore. Its boss fight takes place in a position in the game that connects it to the upper layers of the Grand Cathedral, which is the church's most sacred space. The connection between an emissary of the Great Ones and the church's highest ritual space is suggestive, but not described. Ebrietas is one of the most directly present Great Ones in the main game, and also one of the strangest in terms of her relationship with humans. She's described as having been found and abandoned. The language of the description implies that she was left behind, that something or someone that she was associated with departed or was destroyed, and that she remained. Whether she remained by choice or because she had no alternative is not established. Her association with the choir, the faction within the healing church that had the most direct access to her, implies a relationship that the choir valued. Whether Ebrietas valued it reciprocally is not described. The relationship between the Great Ones and reproduction is one of the more consistently present themes in the lore, and also one of the most unexplained in terms of its purpose. Great Ones seek to have children. The children, when they exist, or when they're present as vestiges, have effects on the humans near them. Whether this is what the Great Ones want, whether they are attempting to reproduce in a standard biological sense, or whether what looks like reproduction from the outside is actually something different, is not established. The human framework of reproduction may not apply to entities that exist on a cosmic scale. The ability of the Great Ones to communicate through dreams is described in the game as a form of contact rather than as language. They reach into human consciousness during sleep and leave impressions. Whether those impressions are intentional communications, the Great Ones choosing to send specific messages to specific people, or whether they're environmental in nature. The presence of a Great One producing dream effects in the people nearby the way a strong radio signal produces interference in nearby receivers is not established. The character of the dreams described in the game's lore varies. Some seem benign, some seem horrifying. Whether the variation reflects different Great Ones communicating different things, or the same communication being received differently by different people, is not resolved. Odon is a Great One who has no form. This is one of the most explicitly stated facts in the game's lore, and also one of the most genuinely strange. What does it mean for a cosmic entity to have no form? The Great Ones are generally described in terms that imply they exist in some kind of physical form, however strange. Eden's formlessness is presented as a characteristic rather than an absence. He exists, he acts in the world, specifically through the production of Odon Writhe and through connections to various human characters, but he does so without the kind of form that the other Great Ones have. Whether this is a choice, a condition, or a fundamental aspect of what Odon is not described. The relationship between the Great Ones and blood is described as fundamental, but the terms of the description vary. In some lore contexts, blood is a medium through which the Great Ones act. In others, blood is something that the Great Ones have or produce that has particular properties. In others still, blood is what connects humans to the Great Ones, a bridge between scales of being. All three framings appear in different item descriptions and dialogues. Whether they're describing the same phenomenon from different angles, or whether blood has multiple distinct roles in the game's cosmology, is not established. The game is consistent in treating blood as important. It is not consistent in describing what makes it important. The amygdala's behaviour in the game specifically its passive presence in Yharnam and its active presence in the Nightmare Frontier, and as a boss, suggests that the same entity type has different modes of engagement with the world. In some contexts, the amygdala ignores you. In others, it attacks you. In others, it serves as a literal pathway, picking up and transporting the player. Whether these different behaviours reflect different amygdalae with different dispositions, or the same amygdala type responding differently to different contexts and stimuli, or a single amygdala that can engage in multiple modes simultaneously, is not established. Their motivation for any of these behaviours is not described. The Great's chalice connects to great ones associated with the outer rim, a term used in the lore to describe a cosmic periphery that is distinct from the cosmos more immediately associated with Yharnam. Whether the outer rim is a physical location in some cosmological sense, or a metaphorical description of great ones that are more distant in some other sense, is not clarified. The great ones associated with the outer rim appear in the deepest chalice dungeons. The Pthumerians had access to them. What the Pthumerians got from that access, and what the outer rim great ones got from the connection, is not described. The question of whether the great ones have a collective purpose or whether they're independent entities pursuing individual aims is one of the most foundational questions in Bloodborne lore, and one of the least answered. They're described with individual names and individual characteristics. But the connections between them, the way their interests overlap or conflict, the question of whether any of them is aware of the others, is not addressed in the text in a way that resolves to a clear picture. Are they a community, a hierarchy, a set of entirely isolated entities? All three readings find some support in the game's fragments. The specific way in which insight relates to Great One contact is described in terms that imply the Great Ones as source, rather than as passive subject of perception. Insight doesn't just allow you to perceive the Great Ones, it seems to represent a connection to them. Whether that connection is something the Great Ones initiate, something that humans develop through exposure, or something that emerges from the interaction between the two without either one being the initiating agent, is not established. The game frames insight as both something you gain and something that is given, and doesn't resolve the tension between those framings. The Great One's relationship with Yharnam specifically, as opposed to other places in the world, is not described in terms that explain why Yharnam was the location where these specific events happened. The old blood was found under Yharnam. The scholars came to Yharnam. The Pthumerians were under Yharnam. The Great Ones are present above and below Yharnam. Whether this is because Yharnam happened to be built over a uniquely significant site, because the Pthumerians chose the site because of Great One presence, and the city grew around the ruins, or because the Great Ones have some specific interest in the geography of this place, is not described. Yharnam is the centre of this story. Why it's the centre is not explained. The formless Odin and the implications of that formlessness extend to the question of how humans interact with an entity that has no physical presence. The Odin Writhe rune associated with him produces an effect that relates to blood bullets. The connection is practical, but the mechanism by which a formless entity has an effect on physical blood in the physical world is described without being explained. Odin exists in some mode that allows him to produce effects without having a form through which to produce them. Whether this is described as a unique characteristic, something that only Odin can do, or whether other Great Ones could also be formless if they chose, is not established. The hunters that the Great Ones are described as cultivating or favouring, the people who receive special attention from specific Great Ones, are not described as having been selected by a clear criterion. Some of them are scholars, some are hunters by practice. Some seem to have no special qualification beyond proximity. Whether the Great Ones select based on capacity, on accident of geography, on something in a person's blood or mind that the Great Ones can perceive and evaluate, or based on no principle that can be identified, is not described. The people the Great Ones contact are connected to significant events. Why those people and not others is not explained. The failure of the Great Ones, specifically the repeated failure to produce viable offspring, as it's described in the lore, is framed as a tragedy that the Great Ones respond to in different ways. Some seem to search for substitutes or alternatives. Some seem to simply exist in the aftermath of that failure without obviously responding to it. Whether the failure of reproduction is central to understanding what the Great Ones want, whether it explains their presence in and around Yharnam and their interest in human contact, is one of the more compelling readings of the lore. But the reading depends on accepting that the Great One's primary motivation is reproductive in some sense, and that framing is applied in the lore without being definitively established. The Orphan of Kos, as a Great One who is both newly born and immediately bereaved, exists in a category that doesn't have a precedent in how the game describes the Great One's development. What a Great One looks like when it's very young, before it has developed whatever properties make adult Great Ones what they are, is shown through the Orphan. Whether what the Orphan is now, the screaming, grieving, fighting figure on the shore, is continuous with what he will become, or whether that development would change him fundamentally, is not described. He is the only example of a Great One's childhood that the player directly encounters. The cosmic hierarchy implied by the game's lore, specifically the question of whether there is a hierarchy at all and what it would look like if there is one, is never mapped. The Great Ones are described as inhabiting different positions in a cosmos that has scale and structure. The outer rim suggests a cosmic geography. The formless implies a category distinction. The described failures and the described contacts suggest ongoing processes, but whether any of this adds up to an organised system with a top and a bottom and relationships between the parts, or whether it's a collection of unconnected entities that happen to share certain properties, is not established. The game implies a cosmos. It does not describe it. Chapter 6. The Scholars of Byrgenwerth and the Knowledge They Shouldn't Have Found Byrgenwerth is described in the game as the origin point of the intellectual tradition that eventually produced the Healing Church and the Blood Ministration and everything that followed from both. The scholars who worked there are presented as the generation that crossed a line, that found something and didn't stop finding it, that accumulated knowledge faster than they could evaluate the cost of accumulating it. The game holds them responsible for the state of Yharnam in a diffuse and not entirely stated way. What they actually did, what specific acts of inquiry produced, which specific consequences, is a question the game leaves substantially open. Master Willem is the most prominent surviving Byrgenwerth scholar in the main game, and his condition suggests that his knowledge eventually outpaced his ability to remain intact. He's found in a rocking chair on the grounds of the college, essentially inert, covered in eyes that have developed on his body from some transformative process. The irony of an intellectual who pursued the capacity to see ending in a state where his body has proliferated eyes is fairly clear. The specific steps from ambitious scholar to this end state are not clearly traced. The description of Byrgenwerth's founding aspiration to ascend to the level of the Great Ones through the accumulation of knowledge is one of the clearest statements of intent in the game's lore. But the specific form that aspiration took, the research methods, the materials studied, the theories that guided the inquiry, are described in fragments rather than as a coherent intellectual history. The game gives you the starting condition, the scholars had ambitions, and the ending condition, those ambitions produced catastrophe, without filling in the middle in a way that gives you a complete picture of how they got from one to the other. The discovery of the old blood in the Pumerian ruins is the pivotal event in Byrgenwerth's history. But the description of the discovery is minimal. They excavated, they found the ruins, they found the blood. What the blood did to them on first contact, whether the effects were immediate and obvious, or whether they accumulated gradually over a long period of study, is not described. The first scholar to encounter the blood in the ruins, and what that encounter was like, is not recorded in any accessible lore document. The discovery that changed everything is itself a gap. Lawrence, the first vicar, is described as the person who took Byrgenwerth's research out of the academy and made it institutional through the healing church. The founding of the church is described as a divergence from Byrgenwerth's original academic approach. Lawrence chose to make the blood accessible, to use it as a medical and religious tool rather than to continue pure research. Whether this was because he believed the blood was safe for broad use, because he saw the institutional opportunity and chose it deliberately, or because something in his own experience of the blood convinced him that distribution was the right approach, is not described. His motivations for the founding act are not recorded. The relationship between Lawrence and Willem after the founding of the church is described in terms that suggest a permanent rupture. Willem apparently opposed Lawrence's decision to take the blood to the public. The nature of that opposition, whether it was a concern about safety, a principled objection to the commercialization of the research, or a belief that what they'd found wasn't meant for broad human use, is implied but not stated. The two men who shared a research tradition arrived at incompatible conclusions about what to do with what they'd found, and the consequences of that disagreement shaped the entire world of the game. The specific knowledge that Byrgenwerth produced is referenced in fragments throughout the game, but never assembled into a coherent body. The scholars found things in the Pthumerian ruins. They developed theories about the nature of blood and about the Great Ones. They produced research that the church later institutionalized and built upon, but the actual content of their theoretical frameworks, the propositions they advanced, the specific discoveries they made beyond the blood itself, is described at the level of implication rather than content. What Byrgenwerth actually knew, as opposed to what it was trying to find out, is never directly stated. The eyes on the inside, the phrase that Willem apparently used as a summary of Byrgenwerth's central aspiration, is one of the more cryptic theoretical propositions in the game. Developing eyes on the inside means developing inner perception, developing the capacity to perceive things that are not externally visible. Whether this was intended as a metaphor for intellectual development, as a literal description of a biological transformation the scholars were pursuing, or as a description of something that the Great Ones have and that the scholars were trying to cultivate in themselves, is not resolved in any single lore text. All three readings are present across different descriptions. The choir, the faction that eventually had direct access to Ebrietas and that represents the institutional inheritor of Byrgenwerth's most extreme research aspirations, is described as the highest stratum of the healing church. Their specific research program, beyond the general description of having direct contact with a Great One, is not described in detail. What they were doing with Ebrietas, what they were learning, what they were trying to produce, is referenced in terms that suggest significant activities without describing them. The choir is doing something. What it is, and what they expected to get from it, is not explained. The college building itself, accessible in the main game, contains evidence of research activities that are not completely explained by any single lore source. Books and documents are present. Research equipment is scattered. The physical space of the college tells a story about work that happened there, but the specific story is assembled from fragments that don't add up to a complete picture. The space feels like it was abandoned during, rather than after a significant event, as though the people who were working there had to leave suddenly and didn't complete whatever they were doing. The Pthumerian connection to Byrgenwerth, specifically the question of whether the Pthumerian ruins provided more than just the blood, whether they provided knowledge that the scholars absorbed and built on, is implied by certain lore passages. If the scholars found documents or artifacts in the ruins that contained Pthumerian intellectual or ritual knowledge, then Byrgenwerth's research tradition is at least partly derived from a much older body of knowledge. Whether they knew this, whether they acknowledged the derivation, or whether they treated their findings as original discoveries is not described. The students who attended Byrgenwerth during its operational period are almost entirely absent from the game's lore. A few figures are mentioned as having passed through the institution, but the school's student body, the intellectual culture it produced, the debates and the failures, and the discoveries that happened at the level of ordinary academic work rather than at the level of historical pivots, are not described. Willem and Laurence as founders are present in the lore. The institution they ran as a living, working school is essentially absent. The question of when Byrgenwerth became aware that the old blood was dangerous rather than simply powerful is not answered. There was presumably a moment, or a series of moments, when the effects of the blood made themselves clear in ways that couldn't be ignored. Whether the scholars responded to those moments by increasing caution, by pressing forward despite the evidence, or by splitting into factions with different assessments of the risk, is described only in broad terms through the eventual rupture between Willem and Laurence. The specific history of the institution's response to early evidence of the blood's danger is not documented. The choir's experiments with ebrietas, whatever they consisted of, apparently produced results significant enough that the institution maintained the relationship over a long period. Whether those results were theoretical, practical, biological, or some combination is not described. The fact that ebrietas is still present in the Grand Cathedral's depths at the time of the main game suggests either that the experiments are ongoing or that the choir has reached an endpoint of some kind from which it hasn't moved. What the choir expected to achieve, and whether it ever achieved it, is not addressed in the accessible lore. The specific scholars who contributed to Byrgenwerth's discoveries and who shaped the institutional culture of the place are mostly unnamed in the accessible lore. Gehrman passed through. A few other figures appear in the story tangentially. But the intellectual community that made Byrgenwerth what it was is largely absent from the record, whether this is because most of them died in the events that ended the institution's active period, because they were absorbed into the church's institutional structure and their individual identities became less important, or because the game simply chose not to develop this aspect of the history, is not clear. The Gate of Byrgenwerth is one of the most evocative architectural details in the main game. It's a gate that separates the college grounds from the surrounding area. Willem sits outside it, on the wrong side of the gate for a man who runs the institution. The gate suggests that something inside Byrgenwerth needed to be kept in, or something outside needed to be kept out. Whether the gate was installed in response to a specific event, as a general security measure, or as a symbolic boundary marking the transition between ordinary knowledge and dangerous knowledge, is not described. It's there. It's significant. Why it's where it is, and who put it there, is not explained. The legacy of Byrgenwerth as it persists in the Healing Church is described in terms that characterize the church as both continuation and betrayal of the original project. The church institutionalized the blood. It also controlled information about the blood and managed the public's relationship with it in ways that diverged from Byrgenwerth's more open intellectual culture. Whether the church's control of blood-related knowledge was a conservative response to what Byrgenwerth's openness produced, a cynical power move, or a genuine attempt to manage something dangerous for public safety, is described in terms that support all three readings without resolving to one. The connection between Byrgenwerth's research and the specific form that the Great One's influence on Yharnam eventually took is one of the most important causal chains in the game's backstory, and also one of the most incompletely described. Something that the scholars did, or found, or made possible, produced the conditions that led to the main game's events. The specific mechanism of that causal connection, the specific steps from academic inquiry to cosmic catastrophe, is assembled from fragments that don't produce a clear narrative sequence. The books that can be found in various locations throughout the game that are described as originating from Byrgenwerth are mostly unreadable by the player. You can see that they exist. You can read their item descriptions. The descriptions say they contain research or knowledge or theories without specifying the content. The game has filled its world with academic documents that are described as significant, but whose content is withheld. Whether this is because the content would be too destabilizing to the narrative if stated directly, because the developers chose not to write it out, or because the inaccessibility of the content is itself a law statement about the nature of dangerous knowledge, is not established. The question of whether Byrgenwerth knew about the Hunter's Dream is one of the details that connect the academic institution to the larger cosmological framework of the game, without fully explaining the connection. Gehrman emerged from Byrgenwerth's context. The dream was established in connection with the Great One contacts that Byrgenwerth made possible. Whether the scholars knew about the dream as a specific phenomenon, whether they theorized about it, whether anyone at Byrgenwerth was aware that their research had produced a space that existed outside time in the service of an entity that feeds on hunting, is not described. The most disturbing reading of Byrgenwerth is not the one in which the scholars were arrogant and suffered for it. That's a familiar moral framework that the game's structure initially supports. The more disturbing reading is the one in which the scholars were right about what they were looking for, but catastrophically wrong about what it would do to them when they found it. In that reading, the aspiration to reach the level of the Great Ones, to develop the inner eyes, to access a higher form of consciousness, was not a hubristic fantasy. It was achievable. The problem was not that the goal was impossible. The problem was that achieving it required becoming something that the people who started the journey no longer were when they arrived. Chapter 7. The women who were not save the women in Bloodborne, who are most central to its unsolved mysteries, are not the ones who are given the most dialogue. They are the ones who are described in item descriptions, who appear in lore fragments, whose histories are assembled from the details of their possessions rather than from their own words. This is partly a function of how the game distributes its narrative, but it also reflects something about the specific role that women occupy in the game's historical horror. They are the ones the institutions acted upon, and the institutions did not record the actions from their perspective. Lady Maria is the figure in this category who has received the most community attention, and for good reason. Her history is distributed across the DL key and the main game in fragments that add up to a portrait of someone who saw what was happening and understood it well enough to be horrified by it, and who then spent a long time trying to contain that horror in a single location rather than escape it. She is in the clock tower. She stays in the clock tower. What she guards there, and why she chose containment over escape, is described in terms that gesture at the answer, without stating it. The woman who appears in certain lore fragments as a scholar or researcher connected to Byrgenwerth is not named in the accessible texts. Her existence is implied by certain artifacts and descriptions, whether she was a student, a colleague, a researcher who worked independently but in the same tradition, or someone whose connection to Byrgenwerth was more indirect, is not established. The absence of her name, in a context where the male scholars are named, is a detail that feels deliberate. Someone knew about her. The record doesn't preserve her. Annalise the Vileblood Queen is one of the most clearly present female figures in the game, and also one of the most unexplained in terms of her specific history. She is the last of her kind, the surviving representative of a bloodline and a court whose other members were destroyed. How she survived when the others didn't, whether she was protected specifically or simply didn't happen to be present when the rest of the court was killed, is not described. Her specific relationship with the Cainhurst Vileblood's destruction, whether she experienced it and survived or escaped it and then returned, is not established. She sits in her frozen hall and extends her hand and offers you a covenant, and the history of how she got to this particular form of existence is implied, but not told. The women in the research hall of the nightmare, the ones who are suspended in the apparatus and who are either seeking eyes or being subjected to a procedure that gives them something other than what they wanted, are among the most disturbing representations of the institution's relationship with their human subjects. They sought something, they were given the means to seek it, or perhaps forced into the seeking, in a way that didn't produce what they wanted. The distinction between volunteers and subjects in the context of the research hall is not clearly established. The game presents people who are being done to in ways that may or may not have been consensual. The significance of Queen Yharnam's pregnancy in the specific context of the Great One's reproductive failures is discussed in lore fragments that don't describe her experience of it. The Pthumerian queen was carrying something significant. The Great Ones were interested in that something. The Church sent an expedition to find her in the depths. What Yharnam herself understood about her situation, what she wanted, whether she had any agency in the events that made her significant enough to be sought out in the deepest dungeons, is not described in any text. Her experience of her own story is absent from the record. The doll is a case study in the erasure of a woman's story through the physical replacement of her with an object made in her image. The person the doll is modelled on, Maria in the most common reading, became the template for something that serves others. Whether Maria was aware that Yharnam had made this use of her image, whether she was consulted, whether the doll is a tribute or an appropriation, is not described. Yharnam's relationship with the doll is described in terms of his feelings. Maria's relationship with the fact of the doll's existence is not described at all. The women of Canehurst, specifically the court that Annalise presided over, are described in terms that suggest an elaborate and functioning society that was then destroyed. What the court was like, what lives the women who lived there led, what their connection to the vile blood covenant meant for their day-to-day existence, is described only in the terms of their connection to the blood and to the hunt's institutional hostility to them. They are defined by their destruction. Their existence before the destruction is not described in terms that give it independent content. The relationship between the healing church and the women it treated or studied is one of the most ethically charged and least directly described aspects of the game's history. The church ran hospitals, it administered blood, its more extreme research involved human subjects. The specific experiences of the women who passed through that system as patients, as subjects, as employees, as adherents, is not recorded from their perspective. The institution's records would describe procedures and outcomes. They would not describe what it felt like to be on the receiving end. The Harrod Garb set, connected to a specific research tradition within the church, references a particular kind of practitioner who operated in conditions of significant secrecy and risk. The descriptions suggest that some of these practitioners were women, and that their specific role in the research program was different from the male practitioners in the same tradition. The difference is implied, but not described.